Welcome to the Korea Society and welcome to Studio Korea. Thank you all to our studio audience for coming in on this wintry day, despite the weather, you're all here. My name is Nikita Desai. I'm the Director for Policy and Corporate Programs here at the Korea Society. And today's program, Investing in Korean Startups, builds on a series of programs that we've conducted here, looking at the startup boom in Korea and looking at Korean entrepreneurship. I'm pleased to welcome our chief speaker today, Alan McGlade. Alan is the managing director at Digital Entertainment Ventures Dev. He's also co-CEO of Dev Korea. Dev is a venture fund that focuses on high growth, early stage companies that are building the next generation digital services and applications. He's also the co-CEO of Dev Korea. It's a recently established fund which invests in and brings top Korean tech companies to the US for an intensive acceleration program. Please join me in welcoming our speaker today.
Thank you.
So, Alan, in your Forbes article that you authored last year, you talk about Korea being an emerging tech hub or an emerging startup hub. What does this mean and where is this going?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, Nikita. It's great to be here.
I'm glad.
I wrote about Korea, but I want to just back up for a second and talk about what's happening globally, because I think that you have to sort of put the discussion of Korea in context. A decade ago, probably, decade, 15 years ago, for a company to have a global presence, they were very often a big multinational company that had the resources to establish offices around the world, to distribute their product around the world. And there's been a fundamental shift in the last 10 years as the world shifts from analog to digital, and it's possible to connect with people on a global basis from anywhere in the world. That is a significant change from the way things used to be. Beyond that, the barriers to entry to enter the global marketplace have changed as well. 10 years ago, I was the CEO of a company that distributed digital music, and we were the first company to do it on a mass scale. We had partnerships with major record labels, Warner Music Group, EMI, Bertelsmann. But to build out the infrastructure to hold the digital masters and then distribute them cost about $20 or $25 million just to set it up. Yeah. We had a big co-location space with towers of machines, with blinking lights, and lots of air conditioning, and people running around with clipboards. And that was just 10 years ago. Today, you would never do that. There's cloud computing. You would probably get started for a couple $100 because you would sign up for DigitalOcean or Amazon Web Services. So the barrier to entry has gone down, and the access to a global marketplace through the internet has become pervasive. So that creates the conditions where various regions in the country can emerge as powerful tech hubs. Korea, so if that's the case, what makes someplace a tech hub? Why would they emerge as an interesting place for new technology to develop? And that that speaks to sort of the conditions of that particular territory. Mm-hmm. Is there a highly educated workforce? Is there a good university system? Are the people there heavy digital consumers that would understand the new products that are coming out? Is there access to major markets? Mm-hmm. Like China and Japan? Mm-hmm. And so where we see tremendous activity is places where there is real interest in digital consumption, a great talent pool, access to interesting markets. Mm-hmm. And it happened in the U.S. It used to always be Silicon Valley. New York has emerged as a major tech hub, in part because there's a very sophisticated workforce here, and major industries are all centered here: the media industry, advertising industry, financial industry, fashion. And so those things, as they undergo their transformation, are sucking in lots of tech talent. Mm-hmm. And creating lots of new businesses. And I saw that same trend emerging in Korea.
Great. So you brought us to our next point. Let's talk a little bit more in depth about Korea. Can Korea create that magic mix of the media and the tech and highly educated workforce? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, certainly the infrastructure is there. Korea has the highest broadband penetration in the world, or if it's not the highest, it's among the highest. Has the highest broadband rates in the world, and that was no accident. The government decided to get there 10 years ago or 15 years ago and systematically improve the infrastructure to allow that. There's heavy digital consumption there. I know when you're in Korea, you see everybody on their phone doing everything. Everybody's connected and using digital services all the time. There's a very good university system, very sophisticated. What I would say is a very sophisticated, highly educated workforce. And Korea is starting to have a real cultural impact. Most people know, a lot of people know Korea for K-pop now, because that was sort of a rage that swept the world. But in music, in design, and in really interesting electronics and technology development, there's a lot going on in Korea. So I thought I saw a confluence of all those things, making it an interesting location for real activity.
Mm-hmm.
Also, you have the juxtaposition to China and Japan. So for many people, this is an interesting gateway to Asia as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. You talked a little bit about the government. I'll just probe you there. Under President Park's policy of the creative economy, supporting the small medium enterprises, supporting innovation. Could you talk a little bit more about that, and if it has any impact on your work in Korea?
Yeah, that's actually, I think, very important. It was really interesting. My first trip to Korea, I was actually booked on a morning show to talk about entrepreneurship and globalizing companies. And they broke away to a news feed right before I came on with President Park announcing the creative economy and how Korea has to diversify in its industry because it's too centralized with Samsung, LG, Hyundai, a few monoliths, and it was really important to start diversifying the economy and globalizing businesses that come out of Korea. Then I went on the air right after that, so it was fantastic. It really set me up nicely. But what I learned through my various trips to Korea is that there is a tremendous level of support. I'd love to see actually that level of support in the U.S. But there's a tremendous level of support at the government, at the government level, for diversifying the economy, for building entrepreneurship, and for not only building companies that look within in Korea, but building companies that can take the stage in the global market. And we actually have relationships with several of those. Would you like me to tell you a little bit about them?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So one of the first agencies we got involved with is NIPA. It's the National IT Promotional Agency. And when we were forming our fund last year for Korea, we explained to them what they were doing, and they gave us a grant to help increase our exposure with that fund. We also struck a deal with the Innopolis Foundation, and the Innopolis Foundation promotes development and research throughout Korea. They have 5 major campuses where they support researchers. Their main one is co-located with KAIST, which is the top technical university in Korea. And we actually have NIPA and the Innopolis Foundation as partners this year for developing new companies that are coming into the U.S.
This is part of the Dev Korea program?
Yeah, it's part of our we call it the Dev Korea Discovery Fund. We actually launched a fund last year specifically to invest in companies at the early stage, accelerate them, and bring them to the U.S.
And what do they do when they arrive in the U.S. in terms of collaboration?
Well, it starts with recruitment in Korea. And we actually have been going through that for the last 2 months. When I leave here today, we're reviewing 23 companies who have become finalists after we've gone through hundreds of them. And so we recruit across the country in Korea through Innopolis, through the co-working spaces and incubators, and through the VCs and the media to attract the most interesting companies. Then we go through sort of a rigorous selection process. Once we get through that process, we orient the companies in Korea for about a month, and then we bring them in groups, usually 4 or 5 companies, to New York to work with us here. The idea of bringing these companies to New York is to teach them about U.S. entrepreneurship, and the sort of the culture of entrepreneurship we have here, which is different than Korea.
Sure. Can you talk a little bit about that? What are some of the challenges that these startups experience? What are the differences in the culture of entrepreneurship between Korea and the U.S.?
Well, it's more highly evolved in the U.S. Because there's just been a lot of companies that have been building from the ground up for many years here. In Korea, the goal, at least it appears among the older generation, the goal was to find a secure employment with a major corporate entity, and the idea of taking risk of building a company from scratch and possibly failing, which is highly likely. Most companies do fail. was something that I think was frowned upon by a lot of people. But there's sort of, so it's almost generational because there's a new generation in Korea that is very, very interested in what's going on in the startup world. We were just talking about this a little earlier. Many of the entrepreneurs that we're meeting they're Korean. Many of them were educated in the U.S., and it kind of opened their eyes to another approach to a career. So we see some momentum behind that. And again, I think it is somewhat generational, but it's like anything else. You reach a certain tipping point, you build up enough enthusiasm around, and it starts to feel safer because you have a lot of other people that are doing it. It's not just you.
Yeah. You talked a little bit earlier, I want to refer to your point that you made about how investment companies look at Korea as sort of the gateway to Asia. How do investors view investment in Korean companies?
I think there's many investors who always want to be the first in on something that looks like it could be a big thing, and certainly the idea of being a gateway to Asia is very attractive. The fact that we now see some real activity in terms of creating new businesses and opportunities to invest is attractive. So there's certainly more attention than there has been before, and as a result of that, Google has opened an office there. TechCrunch is now starting to report on Korea, and all of these things kind of create momentum for investors. I think the major hurdle, and we haven't gotten over this hurdle yet, but we will, is there has been no major high-profile exits for companies that were built, created, grew up in Korea, and then had a huge transactional event. So people look at companies in the U.S. all the time, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or Uber, or whoever it is, and see these incredible valuations and these huge exits. And that attracts a lot of investors. That breeds investment. That hasn't happened yet in Korea, although there are the early stages of that. Companies like Coupang in the e-commerce space, and Kakao in the messaging space. Yellow Mobile has rolled up all these companies and is getting high valuations. So it'll happen. It's only a matter of time, and I think that'll bring a lot more investment in.
Sure. I read somewhere that the return on investment on private venture capital exits has more than doubled since 2012, from about, I think it was 4% in 2012 to I think 9% in 2013. So what do investors look for in terms of the potential, the real potential there for early stage startup companies? How do they know, or what do they look for when they're investing?
Well, you never know. You never know. You can make your best judgments, and the reality is that when you're taking companies at a very early stage, they're not going to all succeed. You have to accept that. But successful early stage investors identify a few companies that are extremely successful, and that's what drives their returns. The one thing about early stage investing is you should never invest in one or two companies. The optimum, they've done a lot of analysis of this, and a portfolio of 25 to 30 companies is one break point that gets the best returns, and then the next break point is 120 companies, and then the next is like 475 or something like that. So you have to build a big portfolio knowing that not all of the companies will be successful. But what do you look for? Since you don't know for sure that the company is going to be successful. One thing we look at is having a great team, right? Are these people, it's almost like a marriage. When you're starting with them at an early stage. So you're going to be, these companies you're going to be with for a long time, and you're going to have much more interaction with them than if they were a more mature company, because you're helping them along the way. So you have to work with them. So you're looking for people that really are smart, they're resilient, they're creative, and they're coachable, and they can adapt to change that comes quickly. And when we look at when we're looking at Korean companies, we also need one of the executives to be fluent in English, because the idea is to take them global. So if everybody's just a Korean speaker, that's going to be difficult for us to do. Then you need to assess the market potential for what they're describing. Can they articulate very quickly and easily what it is that they're trying to build, and what problem or idea they're trying to fix in the marketplace, how they're trying to solve that. One of the challenges in doing that is that many Korean companies have the perspective of their own market. So they're building something and they see an absolute need within Korea, say, for that particular product. I'm going to do a streaming music service that uses social media to make recommendations. And there's no product like that in Korea, so it'll be great. Well, that's fine, but when we review it, we look at the fact that there's 50 companies like that in the U.S. and so can they really be competitive is there something unique about them that will allow them to be competitive outside of Korea?
Right, right. When we talk about startups, how do you see success as an investor in terms of what is the exit strategy for the company, for you as an investor, to sell it again and find new companies, to grow it to a certain size, to market it on the global scale? How do you see that?
Well, every company is going through a chain of events. So we're seeing them they're past the conceptual stage. They've actually probably built a product, and now so you could call that seed or early stage. They need to get enough traction at that stage so that they can make a case to a larger investor, that they need more significant amount of money, usually called a Series A, to really expand their business. Nobody's going to invest several $1 million at a Series A stage unless the product is now approved. It has the ability to get traction, but it needs more money to do that, right? Once they finish the Series A and they grow there, very often then you want to do much bigger expansion, and that's when you go for the even bigger money. So you're guiding them through this series of steps. Not all of them will make it through all those steps, but the idea is to try to get them through those steps so that they become a substantial company on their own. And once they do that, the rest of it takes care of itself. They can either thrive as their own company. Most likely, they're going to be probably not go public. It'll probably be an attractive candidate to be acquired by a larger company. But I tend not to think about what the exit's going to be. If the company becomes successful, the exit will emerge.
Great. I'd like to finally have you share what are some promising startups right now in Korea that you're working with.
Well, we have 9 we invested in last year, and we're gonna add another 10 at the beginning of this year. It was a very interesting mix. Our bias is media and entertainment. We know digital media really well, so we worked with a company. We worked with a company called Moonrock, which actually it was based in Korea, but the principals are now in the U.S. And they're a portal for K-pop, and the only big English-speaking one. So we think that's quite interesting. And we found another media company called Tappytoon, which distributes Korean digital comics. But what they found was that Korean comics are so popular that there was this whole there were these crowdsourced sites trying to translate the Korean comics into English. So because the biggest audience for it turned out not to be in Korea, but in the U.S.
That's
and believe it or not, South America. So they are actually now distributing comics with in English language through new apps. We found a great e-commerce company, and this one wasn't focused on the U.S., but they want to be in the global market. They're kind of creating a Yelp for Chinese tourists coming into Korea. Apparently, I didn't know this, but Korea, one of the biggest sources of tourism is from China. And it's everything from wanting to go places where the K-pop stars or TV stars go to plastic surgery tours. You know, there's all these groups that come into Korea as tourists, but there is no online application for them to be able to navigate the best places on their own. They tend to have to work through tour groups. So they're building out a whole product for that. Those are just some examples.
That's great. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Alan McGlade for this fantastic presentation. I'd like to encourage you to view other programs in the series on our Korea Society website under the corporate tab. If you're not a member, please join us as a member. We welcome you back to the Korea Society for future programs. Our next corporate program is going to be on Korea's economic outlook, and there's information on flyers outside, or if you could just see one of our interns to sign up. I'd like to thank Peter in the sound booth, our Senior Vice President, Stephen Nerper, who's here, Mark Gaston, our board member, and our hardworking interns that are here for the program. And thank you all for coming out, and thank you to our live streaming audience as well.